Hello and welcome to the fourth video discussing Chapter 11 of Government in America, focusing on Congress. This video actually isn't specifically referring to any particular part of the text, but it is going to try and go into a little extra detail on the workings of one part of Congress, the House of Representatives. As you may remember from studying Article 1 of the Constitution, the House of Representatives is designed to be the people's house. It's designed to be the one that is most responsive to the public and to changes in the public opinion. The members of the House have always been directly elected by the people, whereas the Senate was originally chosen by state legislatures. If a state has more people, it gets to have more representatives. So there's a closer connection between the size of the population and the state's representation in the chamber. Members of the House serve 2-year terms, so they have the shortest terms of any part of the government, which means that they are most frequently going back and asking the voters to reapprove them. So if they do something that displeases the voters, there's not going to be a lot of time to make amends and get back on their good side. As of now, there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. That could be changed if Congress ever passed a law to do so, but doesn't look like that's going to happen anytime soon. Okay. Now, because members of the House are elected every 2 years, there's actually a significant difference between different types of House elections. There are the House elections that occur in presidential years, the same time as a presidential election, like 2008, 2012, 2016. And then there are the midterm elections, which are 2 years after a presidential election, in the middle of the president's term. So 2010, 2014. The next midterm election will be 2018. Now, why focus on the difference here? The biggest reason is that in America, a lot of voters, a lot of citizens put so much attention on the presidency that if the president isn't on the ballot, they don't pay attention to the election and they don't show up to vote. And so overall, turnout is higher in presidential elections than in midterm elections. And that is, besides just the fact that the overall numbers are different, certain groups of the population have different habits. Some groups pay more attention to midterms than others. So the type of people that show up for the midterm elections don't look exactly the same as the type of people that show up for presidential elections. Younger voters, minority voters, lower income voters, they are more likely to show up for a presidential election but then not show up at the midterm election, which can make a difference in who will be successful and who will win in those midterm elections. So in addition to that, in the House, the districts are not set in stone, whereas in the Senate, you're elected to represent a state, and the borders of Pennsylvania are going to be the borders of Pennsylvania regardless. In the House, you're elected to represent a district, and the number of districts in your state and the exact composition of that district is likely to change. So each state is divided into districts. Each district gets to elect one representative. That's what makes it a single-member district. And in order to win the election, you just have to get more votes than anybody else. You need to get a plurality. You need to be the first past the post. There could be other systems. We could instead say, look, all of the representatives from Pennsylvania, we're going to put them in a big pot, and we'll assign parties a proportional share of their vote. So if the Democrats get 47% of the vote, they get 47% of the representatives. If the Republicans get 45% of the vote, they get 45% of the representatives. if the Green Party gets 5% of the vote, they get 5% of the representatives. You could do that, but we don't. We have single member, first past the post districts, which is, again, one of those factors that helps contribute to the strength of the two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and to the weakness of third parties or minor parties. Now, how do we figure out what these districts are? Every 10 years, by the Constitution, the United States holds a count to see how many people are in each state. And then based on that count, they will divide up the 435 representatives among the states, with the requirement that every state has to get at least one representative just for their state. There's no representative who has to cover more than one state. Now, if one state's population has shrunk in comparison with another, we may need to move some representatives from one state to another. So every 10 years, Pennsylvania turns out not to be quite as big as it used to be compared to the other states. So it tends to lose a representative or two. Whereas California and Texas, which are growing much faster than the rest of the country, they need to get a couple of extra representatives. This process is called reapportionment, actually changing the number of representatives that each state gets. Once you do reapportionment, you also have to figure out, well, where are all of the people in the state? Where have people moved around in the state? How do we get the new number to fit the state? So you have to draw new districts. That's called redistricting, changing the borders of the district. And sometimes you might actually have to combine two districts into one new district or things like that. This shows you what the districts in Pennsylvania look like. You can see that they often try to draw districts sorta along county lines, but also not always. Sometimes they have very weird shapes, especially if you look down in the southeastern corner of the state. And you may be asking why that is, and we'll talk about that shortly. Because if you can control what shape the districts are, you control what types of voters are in those districts. And given what we know about how certain groups of voters tend to vote, you might be able to get more of your voters where you want them and more of your opposing party's voters where you want them so that they can't do as much damage to you. This process is called gerrymandering, sort of manipulating the borders of a district in order to achieve some kind of goal or give you some kind of advantage. Now, there are different types of gerrymandering. There's incumbent protection, there's partisan advantage, there's demographic representation. So let's talk about each of these. Incumbent protections, we talked about incumbents. They're the people who have the jobs and presumably want to keep the jobs. So you can draw the map so that your district has more of the voters that like you and fewer of the voters that don't. And maybe your neighbor in the next district is from the other party, and you say, well, hey, how about I put all of these voters that don't like me but like you in your district, so they'll vote for you, and my voters will vote for me, and we'll both get to keep our jobs. That's incumbent protection. All right? You're drawing the borders so that the people who have the jobs have a chance to keep the jobs. Okay? Now, this is in the incumbent's interest. They want to avoid opposition. They want to avoid close elections. Okay? They want everybody to know that they're almost certainly going to win. So they might draw the districts to try and make that happen. Similar to, but not exactly the same as incumbent advantage, is partisan advantage. That's when you're drawing the districts to try and help a particular political party. You can draw the districts so that one party will have a large number of seats where 55 to 60% of the voters like them, and then 40 to 45% like the other party. And then the other party gets a small number of districts where they have 80 or 90% support. Well, this means that a lot of the voters who support the minority party, their votes will be wasted. They won't get as many seats as they can. Okay. So if you take a look at the House of Representatives election in Pennsylvania in 2014, you can see that Republicans won 55% of the vote. They won 13 out of the 18 seats that were up. So they won 72% of the seats, even though they got 55% of the vote. Well, okay, they won the most votes, they should get the most seats, maybe you say. Well, back in 2012, the Republicans only got 48% of the vote, but they still won the same 13 seats. So because of the way that they had drawn up the districts, it was that large swing in the percentage of the vote didn't have any influence in who won the elections, because the Republicans were safe in their seats, the Democrats were safe in their seats, but there were a lot more Republican seats than Democratic seats. Finally, districts are designed in a way to try and make sure that there are districts that have a majority of the voters representing minority groups, because if minority groups were sort of dispersed among the population, given that today a lot of people still vote based on ethnic or racial identification, if you distribute the population evenly, then the majority group will often elect people that sort of resemble them, and then there will be no one representing people from minority groups. So you might have majority-minority districts created to try and overcome that. Now, the Supreme Court has said that incumbent protection and partisan advantage gerrymandering are not specifically outlawed, but they've kind of said don't get crazy about it. You cannot make one district way bigger than another district. I can't make one district that has 10 people in it and another district that has 1 million people in it. All right, I got to keep the districts roughly equal. I can fuss with the boundaries to try and increase minority representation in Congress, but within limits. I can't make minority population the only reason why I set the boundaries a certain way. All right, so that's something to keep in mind with gerrymandering. There have been court cases that have gone over this and have established that you need to try and keep the populations of the districts close together so that each person has roughly the same amount of power with their vote. You can't dilute minority voting power by deliberately putting a small number of minority voters in districts, but you also can't totally focus on race by trying to create districts where that are exclusively designed to elect people from certain racial groups. The district must be all connected or contiguous. You can't have part of the district in the northeast corner of the state and the other part of the district in the southwest corner. And as much as possible, the district should be compact and close together so that the people in the district live somewhat close to each other and have some things in common. If you violate these rules, then the map might be rejected. Now, in most states, the state legislature controls the districts, and then the governor has to have approval of it. So if you have control of the state government, that can influence control of the federal government. Now, some states have tried to remove this situation by setting up independent panels that are not supposed to give one party or the other an advantage. We'll see if that continues to sweep through the country. And then sometimes courts will reject the maps and say, you got to go back to the drawing board because you violated one of these rules that we told you about. That's some additional info on the House of Representatives, especially gerrymandering, which is a very important thing to understand. In the next video, we'll talk about some of the quirks of the Senate, and we'll see you there.